Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you know how we always talk about voting rights and how important they are? Well, this deep dive, we're going to look at, how those rights were suppressed under Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Imagine being told straight up, you can't vote because of your race.
It's wild to think about, right? That was the reality for so many people.
Totally. And,
Yeah.
and to really get into it, we're looking at this episode of the Mr. Hutchings History podcast. It's called The Fight for Voting Rights in Jim Crow America. And it's crazy how even after the 15th Amendment right,
Yeah.
the South still found ways to, prevent black citizens from voting.
It's true. It really shows you that progress isn't always a straight line. You have these moments like the 15th Amendment passes in 1870. Everyone's like, okay, things are going to change.
Right. Huge step forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then the South turns around and figures out all these ways to get around it. We're talking like a whole system designed to disenfranchise black voters.
So what were some of the tactics they used? I mean, the podcast mentioned these literacy tests, which, at first glance don't sound that bad. Shouldn't voters be able to read and write?
Yeah. I mean, in a vacuum, sure. But these tests were designed to be impossible. Imagine showing up to vote and they hit you with, name every vice president in U.S. history, or hand you some legal document with the most confusing language imaginable.
Are you serious? That was a real thing.
Oh, yeah, they really did that. And remember, a lot of black citizens at the time weren't given access to decent education. So it wasn't about literacy at all. It was just a way to keep them from voting.
Wow. So messed up. It's like they weren't even trying to hide the discrimination.
Not really. There's this historian, Alexander Keesar, and he talks about how these tests were the perfect example of how Southern states got around the 15th Amendment. Technically, they were following the law, but in reality, they were just being sneaky about it.
Yeah, sneaky and effective. And on top of the test, they had even more obstacles, like poll taxes. It just doesn't make sense to me how you can justify charging someone for the right to vote.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about now, but back then it was a huge burden for black citizens, especially because those taxes could add up year after year.
So even if you managed to vote one year the next year, you might not be able to afford it. It just feels like they were trying to make it impossible for them, especially when you consider the economic realities for many black families at the time.
Totally. It wasn't just about inconvenience. It was straight up economic disenfranchisement. And then on top of that, you have the grandfather clauses.
Oh, man. Those are the worst. Talk about a loophole stacked on top of another loophole.
Right. So basically these clauses said if your grandfather could vote, you didn't have to take the literacy test or pay the poll taxes.
Which, of course, meant that most white voters were exempt, while pretty much all black citizens were still stuck.
Exactly. It's just blatant discrimination disguised as legal mumbo-jumbo.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the human cost. The podcast talked about how the Ku Klux Klan was becoming more active during this time. It wasn't just about legal barriers to voting. It was about creating this atmosphere of fear.
It's a really dark period in our history. The threat of violence, whether it was from the KKK or just individuals, was something black citizens had to deal with every day just for trying to vote. And it wasn't just the threat of violence either. It was the way they did it. The podcast mentioned lynchings and how they were often public events, they wanted everyone to see.
Awful. It's just unbelievable how cruel people can be. But it's also incredible to me that even with all that going on, black Americans never gave up on fighting for their right to vote.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And it wasn't just about individual courage either. They were really strategic about it, The podcast talked about people like W.E.B. Du Bois and organizations like the NAACP. They were so important in this fight.
So it was like a two-pronged approach. Fighting against the laws themselves, but also trying to empower black communities to stand up for their rights.
Exactly. They knew it wouldn't be easy and that it would take time. The NAACP, for instance, they filed a bunch of lawsuits challenging these discriminatory voting laws. They were fighting on the legal front.
That took guts to stand up to a system like that. Did they have any big wins?
Well, one that comes to mind is Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
Okay.
Now, that was about segregation in schools, not voting specifically, but it was still a major turning point.
Yeah, because it basically said that separate but equal was a bunch of baloney.
Right. And even though it wasn't about voting directly, it set a precedent that would have a ripple effect on all sorts of discriminatory laws. And then as we get into the mid-20th century, you see this huge surge in activism. People are fed up and they're demanding change. And that's where you get figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John Lewis, these leaders who really captured the nation's attention.
It feels like this is where the movement goes from the courtrooms to the streets. Were there any moments that really stand out as pivotal events?
Oh, definitely. The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965 were huge.
Those were incredible. And terrifying, too. I mean, those images of peaceful protesters getting attacked on Bloody Sunday,
Yeah.
it's hard to watch even now.
It was a turning point, for sure. Suddenly, the whole country was seeing the reality of Jim Crow, the violence, the injustice of it all. And it created this massive wave of support for voting rights. People were demanding that the government do something.
And that's what finally led to the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It feels like such a landmark achievement after decades of struggle.
Absolutely. It outlawed all those discriminatory voting practices we were talking about. Literacy tests, poll taxes gone. Plus, it gave the federal government the power to oversee elections in states with a history of disenfranchisement.
Wow. So that must have been a huge victory for the movement. Was that the end of the fight for voting rights, though?
It was a major step forward, no doubt. But unfortunately, the fight isn't over. The tactics might have changed, but the goal of voter suppression is still alive and well.
So what are you saying? Like, even with the Voting Rights Act, people are still trying to keep others from voting today?
Well, it's not as obvious as it used to be, right? But there are definitely some things that feel very familiar, like these voter ID laws that some states have put in place. They sound good in theory, but they can make it a lot harder for minority voters and low-income folks who might not have an easy time getting the ID they need.
Oh, right. Because getting an ID costs money and time. It's kind of like that economic barrier we were talking about with poll taxes.
Exactly. And then you've got gerrymandering, which is a whole other beast. That's where they redraw the voting districts in a way that benefits one party over another. It can really dilute the voting power of certain communities.
So messed up. It's like they're always coming up with new ways to rig the system. It's kind of disheartening, isn't it? It makes you wonder how much progress we've really made.
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. The fight for voting rights is still going on. The tactics might be different, but the goal is the same: to keep certain groups from having their voices heard.
Yeah. It's all about power in the end, isn't it? Who gets to have a say in how things are run? It's scary to think that some people are still trying to silence others.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to call out these tactics when we see them, and to fight for laws that make voting more accessible for everyone.
It's like we're carrying the torch now, all those people who fought so hard for the right to vote. It's up to us to make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain.
Couldn't agree more. Jim Crow might be in the past, but the fight for voting rights is far from over. It's an ongoing story, and we all have a role to play in how it ends.
Well said. I think that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. We can't take our right to vote for granted. We have to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep fighting for a democracy where everyone's voice is heard.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Understanding the past helps us fight for the future. And when we all use our voices and our votes, well, that's how we create real, lasting change.
So true. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Jim Crow and the fight for voting rights. It's a heavy topic, but an important one. Don't forget to check out the Mr. Hutchings History podcast for more. And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those votes coming.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.